Hi, everyone. I see people are joining. This is Bret Stetka from Medscape, and we're here today to talk with psychiatrist Dr. Gregory Brown. Let me see if I can get him in here. Dr. Brown, are you there?
Hey Brett, how are you doing, man?
Good, Greg. How are you? Good to see
I'm
you.
doing all right. I was thinking about the last time we saw each other was out in San Francisco at the APA conference. We were
Yep.
doing some yoga, some namaste, taking some ohms together.
Yep, you were outside in a park doing yoga on Medscape, and I didn't know what was happening, and I loved it.
And I thought, the world has obviously changed so much since then. I never would have imagined, I'm sure you wouldn't either, that we'd be in this situation that we're in.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've written a book, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, I want to get your thoughts too on the brain and everything. I've written a book. I won't be too self-promotional, but a history of the human brain.
Yeah.
And it's an evolutionary story of how our brain got here. But you're this accomplished psychiatrist. Just so everyone knows, you founded the Center for Green Psychiatry in Austin. You're an affiliate at Dell, right, at UT.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I'd love to talk about sort of our evolutionary past and how that can be incorporated into mental health care.
So listen, you don't have to self-promote it because I will promote it for you. Here's the book. It's a great book, The History of the Human Brain. I've read the book. There's those books that you give a slow read to, and then those books that you read every page of. And you see, I have my tabs in here.
Yes, thank you.
Brett, let me tell you, I don't think you knew this about me, but I have my undergrad in anthropology at Rice.
Oh, wow.
So
I did not know that. Yeah.
This stuff is super cool to me, man. But I'll tell you, I think that you make sponges sound a lot more appealing and cool than I would.
I'll take it. When I started this book, I had no idea that the sea sponge had anything to do with our evolution, and apparently it did. So that was a
Yeah.
big revelation for me. That's why it's in the subtitle. But yeah, I mean, to kick it off, if you look at animal evolution, the sea sponge was probably the first animal to evolve on Earth about 700 million years ago. I didn't even know it was an animal. I would have said it was seaweed or something before I started writing this book. Um, but yeah, the cells in a sea sponge communicate much in the same way as our brain cells. They use ion channels, electrical currents, some of the same neurotransmitters,
Yeah.
glutamate, GABA. It was a crazy revelation for me. But yeah, if you want to talk about the roots of the brain, you can trace it back to the same sponge you can buy at Target or wherever.
You are making sea sponges cool again. How's
I'm
that?
trying. I'm trying. I'm trying.
Well, and again, you mentioned that the entire story of the human brain begins with a sponge, and I never would have thought that it would trace back to that. I mean, how did that revelation come about through your own research, and what was it like for you learning that detail?
Sure. I mean, I think this, in hindsight, it was probably stupid to pitch a book that goes back 3.5 billion years. That's only 250 pages long. So would I do that again? I'm not sure. But but yeah, I kind of researched the origins of animal life, cells. Single cell life evolved 3.5 billion years ago with bacteria and archaea, and then algae evolves and things become multicellular and cells communicate with each other. So that's kind of the origin. And I ended up talking with a lot of biologists, and there are a lot of biologists studying the sea sponge out there, it turns out.
And,
And
and we and we know that anthropology, of course, is such a broad field, right? So there's medical anthropology. I'd say archaeology falls
sure.
underneath that umbrella. What's the backstory? I mean, what were you thinking when you were like, okay, this is what I want to write this book about?
So I got approached by an agent like 3 years ago because I've been writing for Medscape, where
Yeah.
we are right now for years, for 13, 14 years. I do a column for NPR and Scientific American, and I've always loved the brain and researched the brain in medical school. But I've also loved anthropology and evolution and just where, our origin story, the human saga.
Yeah.
And so the agent asked me, do I have any ideas? And I said, no, I have no ideas. I have no idea what to write about. But I had just read a great book by Sandeep Johar, a cardiologist, about the history of the heart and how
Yeah.
we came to understand the heart. And I was like, has anyone ever done this with the brain? Just a layman's book that is still scientific, but for anyone who's interested. And I don't think anybody had, so I pitched it, and my publisher Timber and Workman Press bought it. And then I had to tell it, and I don't know why I pitched billions of years, but it was a kind of a fun challenge to fit such a long time period, our entire time period, into 250 pages.
Something that I found really interesting, and I'm just interested in hear you talk a little bit more about. You mentioned the book that visceral behaviors and emotions like fear, sex, eating a meal,
Right.
evolved alongside specific brain regions like the amygdala, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, to the point where these activities like sitting down and eating food wasn't just, if I'm understanding it correctly, about just fulfilling our hunger. It was also, there was a mood element, a communal element in that as well. So that we're not just eating to feel full, we're also eating to feel happy as well, for example. I mean, could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, exactly. And I'd love to get your thoughts, just because, nutrition and socializing, all of these things are so relevant to our mental health today. Yeah, so I mean, the idea in a very Darwinian sense is that, of course, eating evolved very early on simply to survive, right? So we just needed nutrients. Our long distant sponge ancestors needed nutrients. And
Yeah.
then, when things become more social, certainly when you get to primates 60 million years ago, and fellow apes, being social was incredibly important. And all of a sudden, having a meal, in our more recent history, wasn't just, rote calories for survival. It was sitting around the fire, gossiping and talking and telling
Right.
stories and going out on a collective hunt or the collective forage. So
Yeah.
I talk about how there's a handful of real pillars or influences in our evolution,
Right.
and our diet and our omnivorism and adaptability mixed with being social primates all went together to kind of give us a
Yeah.
leg up, if you will.
And it's interesting. I just got off a call with a mutual friend and colleague, Drew Ramsey,
Yep, yep,
this morning, who you mentioned in the book. And again, our conversation this morning was really around this idea that nutrition is not just about what's going on in the brain, although that's important. It's
right.
also about the process of making a meal, enjoying the company of the person's meal that you're sharing that with.
Yep.
That's also beneficial for mental health. And it sounds like that all stems back to our evolutionary processes.
I think so, and I've talked about this with Drew too, and he's a big reason why I wrote this book, as I've told him, and I've probably boosted his ego because of this. I was at the APA conference, the American Psychiatric Association conference, and he did this great presentation on sort of the evolutionary origins of why certain nutrients are healthy for us, and he was passing out oysters at 8 a.m., and I found that upsetting yet fascinating, as I write in the book, and I've joked with him a lot about. But yeah, I think that it's just the origin of our diet was so entwined with being social. How we foraged, how we hunted, how we sat around the fire. Once we could cook fire, a million years ago or so, that became the camp, or the commune, if you will. And
You
a lot of,
also Go
yeah.
ahead.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of biologists just think having fire and being able to extend day into night meant we could socialize. We didn't have to forage all day. That's a big part of the idea.
Something else I found interesting with talking about nutrition, you mentioned that eating both meat and plants was crucial to our survival, like omnivorous, eating patterns, right?
Yes.
And again, that's back then. Now you have the vegetarians and people who are limiting their diets. What would you have to say about that today?
Yeah, I think that's a big point I'd like to make in the book, and I probably would make it clearer now if I was rewriting it. But the fact of all of these factors that are so healthy for the brain now are really reflected in our past, as I alluded to earlier. So socializing, being creative, trying new things, challenging our brain. Certainly, diet is huge. Exercise, all of this stuff all these factors was very crucial to where we came from, evolutionarily speaking. And so yeah, I'd like to get your point of view, but the fact that we were so omnivorous meant we were very adaptable.
Yeah.
So periods of climate change for the past, 2 million years since Homo erectus evolved meant that if the trees, the fruits in the trees dried up, we could go out into the savannah and dig up roots and rhizomes. We started hunting, and then we started fishing, which some anthropologists think saved our butts literally as a species,
Right.
a couple 100,000 years ago. So I think it's our omnivorism tied in with these other factors that really is an important message still today.
Right.
A brain healthy, as Drew Ramsey would support as well, like a brain food diet, a brain
Yeah.
healthy diet, I think is very important.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I think it's even all about balance today, right?
Yeah,
And so, I mean, when you have folks limiting these entire food groups, I mean, you're shifting
right,
the ratio between omega-3 and omega-6, fatty
right,
acids. You're, making yourself susceptible to inflammation
right,
in the
right.
body. So again, I mean, I think that the way that we eat today definitely stems back to, our evolutionary past for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I should point out that I talked to someone was asking what the book was again. One More Self-Promotion,
Yeah.
History of the Human Brain, Bret Stetka. You can Google History of the Human Brain if you'd like to buy it. But I think that I talked to a handful of vegetarian, if not vegan, scientists, anthropologists, and they
Yeah.
all acknowledge that eating meat, once we started reliably scavenging meat about 2 million years ago, reliably hunting a million or so years ago, and then certainly scavenging seafood, accessing shellfish beds, tracking tides in order to do that.
Right.
Our brains exploded. I mean, they doubled in size. So, basically, Barbara King at William and Mary, my alma mater, was like, well, I'm mostly a vegetarian, but we have to acknowledge meat was a big part of our story. And I think the big question is, are there specific nutrients in these, in meat or in seafood that drove our evolution? Or was it was just reliable calories?
Yeah.
And I think it's probably a little bit of both. Once you have hunted a gazelle carcass and you have this meat that's preserved by fire, you can go off and pursue creativity. You can try to work on your tool making skills, and that's selected for in a Darwinian sense. So,
So maybe a little bit different, compared to today, because they're going for gazelle carcasses and they probably turn their noses up at the Beyond Burgers, right?
exactly. Yeah. I mean, today it's a whole different deal, but that's sort of how it went. Where it's going, who knows? That's more your and Drew's territory.
I'm interested, Bret, in the, if you could talk a little bit more about the evolution of intelligence, because I thought that was super cool too. You mentioned,
Sure.
macaque monkeys hanging out in trees, they're living longer, and intelligence is kind of something that developed with that process. Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Sure. So the idea, and I talked to a lot of biologists about this, is that after the dinosaurs went extinct, it's strange that this all relates to dinosaurs, but it seems to. About 66 million years ago, mammals could really thrive. Prior to that, mammals had been small, little chipmunk-looking things, running around. Well, the big dinosaurs were really running the planet. It was a reptilian planet for a long time, millions of years, and so once they go extinct, one branch of mammal, decide, natural selection, they end up living in the trees, and that's beneficial for them. And because of that, they become very social. They're in a community, they're stuck in a tree. So they're interacting with each other all the time. And so there's natural selection for being very social, having social intelligence.
Right.
Finding fruit, we develop literally a third cone in the primate eye so we can see red and purple and fruit, just find food. And that's a communal pursuit. So that's really the root, I think, of why socializing is a deterrent of Alzheimer's or dementia, and it's so important
Right.
to brain health. And chimpanzees, our closest cousins, and bonobos, they maintain about 50 close friends, including family, by
Right.
grooming each other. Very complex social societies, and
Yeah.
once we develop language, we can triple that, according to a few psychologists, to 150. And still to this day, humans can maintain about 150 social, like real meaningful relationships, whether on Twitter or family or friends.
And it's
So,
weird because in clinical practice, sometimes it's like pulling teeth to remind my patients that, a social community is actually a form of self-care, right? I mean,
sure, yeah,
there's all sorts of evidence to support that. And it also, as you're writing about in your book,
yeah.
goes back to our ancestors as well and the way they were behaving.
Completely. I'm curious. So when you talk to patients, what do you recommend that sort of reflects our past like that? That's a great example.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm not going into as much detail, obviously, as you
That
are in your
would
book.
take too long. Yeah.
But again, just reminding people that the community aspect is important, whether that's meeting with me once a week, whether
Right.
that's, making sure you're really plugged in to those conversations that you're having with your family and your friends,
Right. Right.
people who are religious, joining a church group and making sure that, there's someone to hold you accountable. If you're not religious,
Yep.
making sure you're involved in a community center or something. All of those things have healing potential when it comes to treating depression, anxiety,
Yep.
and just making people feel better overall.
Right. That's yeah,
Yeah,
which is great. It's such a part of our story, and it's often lost in medicine. I feel like
right.
that that aspect of it, which is what psychiatrists and doctors like you are so great at, just incorporating, whether you want to
Right.
call it holistic or self-care. It's all these factors that are so important to just being a human and being mentally healthy, right?
Yeah, and the other thing you mentioned I thought was really provocative, and I totally agree with this, that the idea of the brain is both good and bad. So I think of, I mean, seriously, think of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
brain as being something that can obviously allow us to love, it can produce purpose, it can allow us to create, but it can also give rise to psychosis and depression and
yeah.
anxiety, if these mechanisms and circuits aren't working properly, right? So talk a
Right.
little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that was interesting. I wrote about this for Scientific American and Medscape a few years ago. The idea that as your brain gets more complex through evolution, complex function begets complex malfunction, I think was something I had in the book. As far as I know, when I wrote this piece a few years ago, no other species on Earth gets psychosis or schizophrenia in the way that we see it. Certainly, animals have other forms of what we would call mental illness and grief, chimpanzees, orcas, elephants. But the idea is that our brains got so complicated because that favored our species. We weren't the fastest on the African savanna. We weren't the strongest. Like we had no chance against a lion.
Mm,
So cognition was really where selection acted on us. That was our big advantage. But when things get complicated and we have a really complex brain, probably the most complex entity in the known universe,
mm.
when it goes wrong, things can go really wrong, and
Yeah,
and
yeah,
you get pruning issues with the neurons, and you get schizophrenia and psychosis. So yeah, the more complicated things can be great. We've taken over the planet for better or for worse, the only species to have done that. But yeah, when things go bad, we have the capacity for terrible violence and
right.
mass murder and xenophobia and all the bad parts of being a human, for sure. So it's a balance, and I think we're all culturally trying to obviously deal with that, especially in the past year.
Right, right. And
Yeah,
some of the biggest takeaways, for me, are at least that, the way things were back then definitely play a role of the way that we understand the brain today. Because there's still so much that we don't know,
sure.
Brett.
Yeah,
And so like digging back into our past and looking at, the way things were, the way our ancestors behaved,
yeah.
learning from a sea sponge, if you will, I think can definitely benefit, clinical practice today.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And you actually practice and I don't, so I'm curious what you think. But I do think that looking back is very informative for how our brain
Yeah,
works today and what's healthy for our brains,
yeah,
and our bodies, and just being a conscious human in the world, for sure. And I think obviously cultural evolution is so much faster than biological, that's the bigger issue about where we're going and
yeah.
what things are going to look like. But yeah, I love that psychiatrists like you are incorporating this into patient care.
And when you were talking about grooming, the first thing that came to mind for me is like during COVID, we just don't have that same amount of physical touch um,
Right.
with other people. And so during this pandemic, I actually adopted a dog. I adopted a puppy. It's just
Oh,
my
nice.
wife in here and I here in the house. We don't have any kids. Parents are older. They're in a different city.
Yeah.
So, there were just stretches of time. It's like I was just missing shaking someone else's
Right.
hand, right?
Yeah.
And so, again, we know that those grooming behaviors stem back to our evolution, and that's part of why they're so important for our overall mental health and well-being, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm a pet lover and animal lover. We've had cats and dogs, and yeah, I think I saw your dog on Instagram. Super
Yeah,
cute. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
No, I totally, yeah, I think we've all struggled with that for the year. I mean, we've only had like 3 people over to our house this year. It's been a
Right,
very strange social situation, and I think we all crave it because we're
right.
social creatures, and it's key to our mental health.
What are some of the major takeaways? Again, as you're writing the book, you know, you're an expert in the topic, but I'm sure you're learning more as you're writing it. I mean, what are some of the most provocative or most profound lessons you learned in writing this book?
I really think for me personally, it just went back to, how our past does inform our future. I think, really just thinking about what is healthy as a species or as a mammal to be, in terms of diet and socializing, and really being creative, and I think challenging our brain, in the absence of really any effective therapy for, say, Alzheimer's. I mean, there are treatments out there, but they're not curative, of course, as you know, and
Yeah.
I think to really preserve our cognition and preserve our well-being, really thinking about this stuff, and just challenging ourselves. A lot of people ask me about crosswords. I'm sure they do for you
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
But if you already do, and that's great. But if you already do crosswords and you're good at them, it's not going to add much.
Right.
But just continually so try something new. Try a new hobby.
Right.
Think about a new idea or subject, or take up the guitar. Whatever it is for you.
Right.
For anybody individual, just challenge your brain, and I think that's partially how we got here. We were making those hand axes 2 million years ago, and that's why our lineage, that kind of creativity is part of why we survived.
Well, let me tell you, Bret, it's a great book. For those watching, here's the book. It's a history of the human brain. When we hop off, I will share it on my account and put the link in there so where folks can go on Amazon and check it out. Let me tell you, it was a really great read. I enjoyed the information. The storytelling is beautiful in there as well. So, I mean, I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Greg. This has been super fun. We'll put it up on Medscape too, and I'll put it up on mine. So I appreciate it. Great talk, and let's do it again.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you again in person.
Yeah, sometime soon.
Okay, stay well.
All right. All
Bye.
right.